Welcome, everyone. This is your brother, Asar Imhotep. Today is Thursday, August the 20th, 2020. And for our show today, we welcome back Dr. Shamarka Keita as we talk about race, its social construct and history, and everything surrounding that. So we'll be back in a sec. Welcome again, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all who are catching this archive. And today we have a very important and special topic. A couple of shows that we've had concerning the history of Africa, as always, in the Nile Valley, sparked a lot of questions, and a lot of them were centered on the concept of race. And I found myself trying to explain certain things regarding the concept of race and how it is, at least in my opinion, inappropriate when trying to get to the deep essence of the culture and movements of the people of the ancient Nile Valley. And so there were some certain things that I knew that a lot of us had to unlearn. And so uh, I invited, our special guest today, Dr. Shamarka Keita, who is a biological anthropologist, to help us make sense of this concept of race, its origins, and, its usefulness or not when we're talking about historical and social matters. And so without further ado, I welcome back Dr. Shamarka Keita. How are you doing, sir?
Hello, how are you?
I am well. I am well. Uh, Given the nature of what I had just stated, you weren't here for these past few conversations, but in the comments and in my inbox, I just kept getting bombarded with should we think about this, and in terms of the Egyptians being black, and to what extent does that go beyond the borders of black and African, and people don't seem to know the difference between a black and an African, and if there is one, and it's just a whole bunch of stuff that ultimately would require a textbook and a series of conversations to kind of help the layperson understand the history and the labels of these things. And so I just wanted to get some insight from you to help my viewers understand what is it meant by the concept of race. What was this label attempting to answer as a catch-all, as it regards human populations, and uh and to ask you some further questions on this usefulness, and how can it be applied or not applied, or what's more useful in trying to categorize human groups, etc. So I just wanted to first ask you, what is this concept of race, and where did this notion come from?
All right, we need to think about science versus our daily social use of terms.
Hmm.
And that may be true for many things. Okay. So to the term race itself was used a long time ago just to mean a group of something. I mean, you could, you might see something in some uh, document or some essay that talks about a race of poets, a
Hmm.
race of this or a race of that. And in that case, it's just the race is just a synonym for group. Now, keep that in mind because that notion of group is still at the heart of the concept. Okay, now, in terms of science, scientific use of race, we go back to the 17th and 18th centuries when, in the Enlightenment period and after that in Europe, so called Enlightenment period, they were cataloging the world. And in cataloging the world, they were trying to order it systemically or systematically, I should say. And so, in addition to naming rocks and looking at plants and animal species and grouping them, uh, eventually, their attention turned to humans. This is just a very general story, but it should be a story that should be easy to understand. And so, the term race comes out of those efforts of classifying or systematizing the natural world. I'm in some sense I'm being generous when I say
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
but this is accurate and in the most abstract sense. Now, it is quite true that after that ordering of the world, or just grouping things in nature, or grouping people, let's talk about people since we're talking about race, that people, certain European scholars, then proceeded to say that certain races or subspecies were better than others. Okay. All right. So some scholars say that you can't talk about the notion of race and race is subspecies, by which we mean a division of a species, without talking about the hierarchy that came along with it or that was closely associated with some of the people who invented the categorizations, or I should say the taxonomy, which would be a better word. So you have someone like Linnaeus who actually used the trinomen, the nomenclature. So Homo sapiens afer referred to tropical Africans. Homo sapiens Neptunianus, which referred to people in tropical Oceania. Homo sapiens Eurapeus, which referred to Europeans, and so forth and so on. So he came up with 6 subspecies. Okay, and yes, he did think that the Europeans were better. So, and he may have used, I'm not recalling it exactly, but however he designated uh, Europeans, he thought that they were better than the other subspecies of human beings. We tend to know the actual other names given to races from Blumenbach, who is most famous perhaps for having coined the term Caucasian. Okay, so he also had a scheme of different uh, divisions of humankind. And so you ask, where does it come from? Okay, so these are divisions that these natural scientists have come up with, and they're trying to express, leaving aside their own prejudice for a moment, they are expressing, trying to organize the diversity of human beings. Okay. Now, I think Blumenbach has gotten a bad rap sometimes, uh, or the criticism of him is sometimes overdone. He did say that a particular skull from the Caucasus Mountains in what's now Georgia in Asia was the most beautiful skull he'd seen. And then he proceeded to, extend the term uh, uh, Caucasian, which actually refers to the people that live in the Caucasus Mountains. So
Hmm.
today there are people who live in the Caucasus Mountains who are actually you would use the term Caucasian. So, so if you look at certain old literature, not scientific literature, but other types of literature, when they talk about Caucasian, they're actually talking about those people and those people alone. Anyway, this term gets extended to other Europeans, and then it gets extended beyond, and even beyond them. So you ask a basic question about where did it come from? The notion of dividing people, or grouping people uh, under the assumption that they are that the individuals that you're grouping into different groups are related to each other, or that they form a unit, comes from a time when Europeans were organizing species in general of the whole planet. Okay, it comes from that time. Now, simultaneously, while that's going on, of course, we have the beginning of the trade in persons of African captives and others, the colonization of the world. I mean, the travel of Europeans, and then eventually. So, what happens is that some of these scientific terms, coupled with their attitudes, uh, uh, become social designators. At least, eventually, this is what happens. In a way, I'm really getting ahead of the story, and they really become social designators in situations where there's a comparison to be made. I dare say that a child growing up in England, even a wealthy child going to school in Germany in 1650, or I don't know, well, 1800, let's pick a later year, 1850, would not have grown up calling him or herself a Caucasian. It's only when you get into a context when there are other people that they would have identified themselves in other kinds of ways. And the same is also true, for that matter, for tropical Africans. Amongst themselves, they would have designated themselves by their own ethnic identities. Although even within Africa, there may have been situations in the Sahara and other places where if there was a phenotypic contrast in physical appearance, you can find documents where people talk about blacks versus whites, Arabic documents. Of course, the funny thing about that is a lot of those people called white in those Arabic documents aren't any whiter than I am in terms of their complexion. That's another story. That's another kind of story that would have to be told. So, so I've talked about the science part. Now, what happens is that the term race, which is technically a synonym for subspecies, although some taxonomists would disagree about that, or they have a different usage. So they would say that the races would be populations within a subspecies. A subspecies would be the rank above that. I cannot pass beyond this without mentioning Darwin. If you read Darwin very, very, very carefully,
Hmm.
several books, you'll see where Darwin, in essence, implies that before you label something a subspecies, that for him, it almost would have to be an incipient species. In other words, for it to deserve a label, to be recognized as a really distinct population, uh, uh, that is not the usage that was common. It's not even the usage that for those who used and thought that races had a certain biological reality. That was not the definition that they understood before. The reality came in the fact that uh, for people that you could see differences as you travel from space. I mean, as you travel across geography, and those differences are visible. So saying that there are no races is not the same thing as saying that there's no differences. So to sum that up for you, from a science point of view, in terms of modern biology, we say there are populations, but there are no races. There are some exceptions in terms of what some scientists will say. They'll use the word race, but they won't use it the way Darwin talked about subspecies. They will use it as a term to describe the same groupings that you know, and but they will acknowledge that they can't claim that these are evolutionary units, that they're totally separate, that that everyone within the unit is more like everyone else in that unit, which is what the term tends to imply. Whenever you group things together, you tend to imply that they're more like uh, each other within that group than they are like whatever criteria you're using, than they are like anyone else in any other group. And we know that that's not true. So when people say that race is socially constructed, and so I'm jumping now from the science, the strict scientific notion, to social usage. And that social usage does have its root initially in a kind of a misuse of science or a poor use of science. When we say that race is socially constructed, what we're alluding to is the fact that in for example, American society, there were actually political and social definitions that were made to say who was going to belong to so and so group, and those groups were called races. But that's erroneous, from my point of view. So the demographic groups of America that get labeled as races are not really races, but they are groups, they are populations, they are units of society. They most certainly, in the case of African Americans and of Latinos, Latinx people who've come into the American context, they most certainly do not represent groups that are homogeneous within themselves, that consist of uniform individuals. And of course, we know based on DNA studies that even many Latin people, Latinx people, who have a sort of stereotyped Latin look,
Mm.
have African ancestry and they have Native American ancestry. They may not call themselves Afro this or Afro Cuban or Afro Peruvian or whatever, or indigenous, but they have those ancestries because back in their own countries, there's a distinct notion of who is Black or who is Afro descendant versus who is an indigenous descendant. And although many people may have those ancestries, they are not designated as belonging to those groups. And that's a very interesting phenomenon too, because I don't know at what point in a country like Cuba, post-revolutionary Cuba, or even pre-revolutionary Cuba, I don't know at what point someone of mixed ancestry calls themselves a white Cuban versus an Afro-Cuban. Today, because of various things, you have some people in Latin American countries now who before had white privilege, but who are now claiming their African ancestry. And I don't know if they get a benefit from it or not. Maybe sometimes they do, or if they've just decided that this is not something they're going to deny. So race is socially constructed for me when the term is being misused, because for me, it is a scientific term. It is a taxonomic category, but humans don't divide into races. As I said before, for living human beings, there are populations, but there are no races, because a population implies a certain level of distinction that does not apply for any subdivisions within living human beings. Is that useful to you?
Yes, and it would seem like uh, it is a case of, at least based on what you're saying, that in reality, that it was a social layperson's concept and grouping that scientists used the label to try to find a scientific basis for the groupings, which then has creeped back in a reformatted fashion back into the lay society, with some additional, baggage in terms of a value set, in terms of what these particular uh these groups have in terms of behavior, in terms of intelligence, and things of this nature. So it's kind
Okay,
of come full
okay.
circle, because
Well,
the word race itself is just a word for, out of the romance languages, a word for family and lineage, you
well,
know.
okay. Let me go back now, because I,
Okay.
I I would argue, no, I would say that again. Let me go back to the the post or the Enlightenment period, the post Enlightenment period, when
Hmm.
Europeans were grouping and systematizing things in the world, doing geology, digging up dinosaur bones, looking at botany. Darwin's on the Beagle, but other people that are ordering the world. Those were not lay people. I mean, those were trained scientists for the most part, natural historians. They weren't poor folk who were standing around grouping people. There's a long history before those people of there being even people of African and other descent in the European world. Some of them managed even to be successful. Think of people like Alexander Pushkin or the Dumas family, who wrote the Three Musketeers, and Pushkin was the father of modern Russian literature. Uh, uh, Pushkin was quite proud of his
Hmm.
African ancestry, but he was still a Russian, and he called himself, "I'm a Russian man who numbers a black in his ancestry." I mean, so kind of a different way about thinking about some things. And there are people like that in Europe walking around now who have a Congolese grandmother or this or that or the other, who, because they have whatever money or the education they have, they just function in those societies. If it comes up, it comes up. But as long as it doesn't show in their faces, that ancestry, again. But I've digressed here. So
Yeah.
Linnaeus, Blumenbach, and others, uh, and there's a whole bunch of others who organize the human species into groups based on phenotype, on physiognomy. Those people were scientists of some stripe or another.
Hmm.
What happened is that their categorizations got turned into social categories. Okay.
Hmm.
And it is now the political class, which later on reifies those social categories, thinks that they're scientific, even though now it knows it's not. And the reference actually goes back the other way. I mean, in a strange kind of way. So, again, let me say this, that from the point of view of subspecies and high levels of distinction and differentiation, going back to like I said, a closer reading of Darwin, there are no human populations currently living that are that distinct from each other. Now,
Hmm.
some people say this. Some people will ask the question, well, hey, but isn't it true that forensic scientists can tell the difference? So if there's some blood, at a crime scene, and let's say the I don't know, the Serbian whatever has come and done something, and somebody got killed, and their blood is, well, can't they take that blood and tell where that person is from? Yeah, well, oftentimes it is possible using fast evolving markers to get an idea about the likely place that someone may have come from, or their ancestry.
Hmm.
And then we assume that they've come from certain parts of the world, although that may not be true, because where your ancestors came from and where you came from may be different. But the
Hmm.
point is that I'm trying to get to is simply this: the level of difference required to make an identification to any number of pre-existing human populations, no matter how you define them, Icelanders, Ebos, whatever, that level of populations. Notice I haven't put any other labels on them. The level of differentiation required to make an identification is lower than the level of distinction required to declare the existence of subspecies or races. Okay. However, the political class picked up the term race, especially in this country, but also in Latin America. They picked up the term race and they applied it to the groups that people like Blumenbach called races, the races of human beings. There are plenty of books with that title, except that those things weren't really races. But what the political class and the social class and social tradition did is started calling these populations that are not really races, races. So now the term race has a colloquial meaning. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
It means a group. So we talk about this. And then at different levels and in different places and different spaces, the term race is taken on a whole nother meaning and use, sometimes almost valorized by all kinds of people from all kinds of different groups. And we see the word gets we see it get transferred to various situations, and we see odd things happen with it, you know. So if race is supposed to imply a unit that's basically distinct, at least to some level, 90%. This is what's the definition of subspecies in terms of the zoologists who debated whether or not the subspecies, namely the trinomen, should be used, whether or not the subspecies category was useful. There was a debate between 1954 and 1960 in the pages of Systematic Zoology. That's a long time ago, 60 years ago. There was a debate amongst people who study elephants, bees, and butterflies, and they were saying, hey, is it useful to divide these species formally into subspecies, quote unquote, into races? And they basically came away saying no. Now they still do it, and there was a debate about, well, are these subspecies evolutionary units? Or are they just pigeonhole devices? So you've got some gopher that's got a brown nose and red ears, and 5 miles away there's another gopher, same species, who's got a red nose and brown ears, and so they put them into two different groups.
Mm-hmm.
So this is gopherensis blah blah blah, and this is gopher so and so, but they're the same species. They're not really that different, you know, other than those traits that you see. They're different, but and you can make an identification, but do they deserve to be thought of in Darwinian terms of incipient species? Well, usually not. I mean, sometimes maybe yes, sometimes maybe no. And I won't talk about the problem, but there were certain problems that were identified with the subspecies category, actually with specific subspecies that had already been identified. The zoological taxonomists identified problems with the groups that had already been created, in the sense that oftentimes there was a lot of overlap. You may not have seen the overlap in the beginning when they were first named, because they saw the ends of ranges, so they saw the extremes, and they didn't see the critters in between, so to speak. So there's some technical language associated with that, which I won't talk about at this point. But suffices to say that modern humans, living human beings, no matter what level of population you choose, are not distinct enough to merit the term subspecies or races. Although you will still see, because of a particular historical tradition within scholarship and society, you'll still see some of those same units being used as units of study, units of analysis, but they'll say, oh, but these aren't races. they're not really racist. But interestingly enough, they correspond to the same groupings. So there's still some uh, epistemological and other problems, operational problems either. Now, when it comes to actual social construction of race, the easiest example to give to you is the fact that the law in South Carolina said that anybody with any known African ancestors or quote Negro ancestors was going to be designated as colored. Now, obviously, the society had to know, and obviously people had to agree on that. Okay, but you could go to other states where the rule was if 1/8 of your ancestors or 1/16 or just different numbers. So you could go from one place to another uh, and be one thing or the other. In practice, though, because of the way society works, if you grew up calling yourself colored, black, whatever in South Carolina, chances are when you went away to school, unless you deliberately were passing, chances are, irrespective of how you looked or whatever, you were going to still call yourself, you were going to identify with the social group you grew up within. Not everybody did that, of course. And in some places, people didn't always ask. And in some parts of the country, I dare say, there are probably some people in places like Maine and New Hampshire who don't know that they have some African ancestry because their distant relatives were accepted and it's been forgotten. And I know that's been true in most certainly in certain European countries. People, it's been forgotten, or people don't even think about it. But when you have a social definition, and that's the easiest example to give you of a social construction. So when you can have a so-called race that in theory is supposed to consist of individuals who are near uniform. But if race is supposed to imply units of near uniform individuals, clearly then if we have an Adam Clayton Powell and Willie Mays in the same group, that doesn't correspond to anything that a naturalist in the 16th or 17th century would have called a race. Okay. Yeah. Those entities are in the same thing. Now, that doesn't mean that they couldn't be related. That's a whole nother discussion. But the way these groupings were made initially was based on morphology. Although for Darwin, the ideal of taxonomy was that you reflect phylogeny or genealogy. But in actual fact, there was an assumption made that similarity meant genealogy or close relationship. There is a term, and I'll just use this one term called polytopicity, not typicity, but polytopicity, that describes a situation where you have creatures who are almost identical in terms of their morphology, their shape, shell shape, whatever, coat color, but they live 5,000 miles apart. Should they be put in the same species, the same subspecies, if they're that far apart? What's the likelihood that they're related? Anyway, that was one of the kinds of problems with the subspecies category that zoological taxonomists talked about in the late 1950s. And in terms of human beings, you already know an example of where it's been shown by DNA, assuming the DNA captures genealogy more effectively, or core genealogy, when with the idea of some people in the Pacific Ocean, the Melanesians and Africans. Some people thought that Melanesians and Africans, they used to be called Oceanic Negroes and African Negroes, and you can find some old books, and books not that old, where they're all called Negroids, and they're put together based on their phenotype. But we know from DNA and genealogy, but even when you look at skeletons, they're not exactly the same, and we know they're not close. We know those people in Melanesia are closer to mainland Asians than they are to Africans.
Indeed. And it's like, how should I say? I mean, ultimately, it appears again, and you know, I attack a lot of things, linguistic wise, because language can tell you a lot about the psychology of a people. And so, again, with this concept of race, it's a term that exists beyond the the Enlightenment, and is still used in its
Yeah,
original sense
yeah.
in the other languages. And it's kind of like, how should I say, like when we think of a scientific theory, the
Mm-hmm.
concept of a theory existed before scientists, got a hold of it and used it. And the laypersons, everyone knows that, in science, when they talk about a theory, is something totally different than when the layperson talks about it. However, the layperson's notion of a theory is a more correct one historically, because it's just a speculation or a contemplation versus, a set of explanations, that explain a body of facts that were, derived from a number of experiments in, the scientific sense. And so, it gets confusing, because like when Latin people, they talk about la raza. La raza is just your family, your lineage, but they
Well,
don't
yeah,
talk. There's
yeah.
no such thing as a sub family. There's no sub la raza when you're speaking on a local level. But of course, in science, they use it differently. And I think this is part of the conversation that has to be understood, as you alluded to at the beginning of the conversation, that when you're talking about a scientific way of looking at something, and the non-scientific, not the layperson's way of looking at it, that trying to combine those concepts, you know, um, causes a lot of confusion, because they're trying to merge the two as if they're speaking about the same thing. And so, even with the latter part of your conversation, I want to bring up Sister Kamala Harris, who is, running with Joe Biden now for vice president, of the United States against Donald Trump. And so it's a big controversy that she considers herself black, but now in this new age, that for a lot of quote unquote black folks, she's not black enough. So she has a continental Indian mother, and then a father who is a child of mixed heritage himself, with, I think, an Irish or father or something to this nature. And but her great, grandfather and mother and all of that were black people from the Caribbean or whatnot. And so, because the quote unquote Africanness goes that far back, even though we have pictures of her with her great grandmother in her lap, and she looks like any quote unquote Jamaican that you can see, that's not good enough. So a lot of people are dismissing her, saying that she's not black, although she herself claims that she is black, and she's been identifying as a black woman for a number, like, all her life. And
So
so,
what? So what? Well, I think that what you're doing. I don't know if you're asking me a question, but
yeah,
you are pointing out something that a lot of people don't necessarily want to talk about.
yeah,
You're pointing out the fact now. Uh, she does have the by South Carolina law the prerequisite drop of what would have been called colored blood at one time,
mm-hmm,
and she was socialized and identified with that growing up. She, had she grown up in England, it might be different. Had she grown up in France, but she grew up in the United States. She did go to Howard, and she's at AKA and all of that. So now there's an interesting question: do we, as an Afro American community, uh, grant passports
mm-hmm,
uh, to people based on our acceptance of them? I mean, and or should we, or should when in fact historically it hasn't been up to us. Now I'm going to use an anthropological term. We talk about etic versus emic distinctions, And these actually come from, as you know, linguistics, phonetic and phonemic. Okay, so the emic description of the world is the one that the group gives itself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the etic description is that which is imposed on, is how it gets ordered. So you, as the linguist, you determine the phonetics. You
Mm-hmm.
know, of you hear somebody speaking a language and you organize it and put it in a book so you can be Dr. Imhotep. But the people themselves uh, are, you know, when they describe it, that's considered to be the emic description of what's going on. Emic. Okay, so I just bring that up to say that it is an interesting question. She grew up. She identified with as a quote black person. She is not a descendant of African captives on U.S. soil.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, she is a descendant of African captives in the Caribbean. Uh, Most certainly in times past, that would have been, you know, the definition politically and legally. She would have had no other place to be other than, you know, a quote black person. Of course, as you said earlier, in the current world, there's more fluidity around these points. So I suspect that there are people, and in fact, I know there are people like her who in Britain or France or wherever might not call themselves black. That doesn't mean they're going to deny that they have some African ancestry, but in a day-to-day social existence, that's not the social domain. The world may not be organized in that fashion. You know, the ironic thing about it is that there are people who are a lot darker than she is, from various parts of the world. Uh, if you were just using phenotype, who obviously aren't going to call themselves black because black in America is tied to African ancestry,
Mm-hmm.
which is another sort of interesting genealogical manipulation. Although I suspect that a Melanesian coming to the U.S. may get tired of being asked, you know, after a point, well, you say you're from the Pacific Islands, which islands? Because there's no people, I don't know any Polynesians who look like you. They might eventually just get tired of that and call themselves black and just point out to people that, well, you know, well, I'm black, but I'm not African. I'm not African American, or I'm not an African. People from Vanuatu and places like that. You know, I don't know what they do when they come here, and I don't know if my scenario is accurate in terms of people getting tired. The U.S. government has determined that. I mean, we decided. Well, we've been using the word Afro American for a long time. Uh, African American is something that I think emerged in the 70s. I think Jesse Jackson popularized it. But what happens when you have an Egyptian or an Algerian who calls himself or wants to mark on those forms African American? They sometimes get told, oftentimes get told, oh, no, 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 you can't mark that. That no, you're no, the government says that if you come from North Africa that you're supposed to mark white. So I've actually had Egyptian colleagues, Egyptians that I know, tell me interesting stories about how the government tells me to mark this, um, but my wife tells my sons to my children to mark African American. So you have a tension there, you know, because they are Africans. They may not be black, their skin may not be black, but of course you can find black Egyptians today as well. From any of those countries, there are people there who are dark enough who get lynched in the street in Mississippi in a heartbeat. And you know, so which is not a scientific or a social criteria for anything, but it is a real criteria in terms of lived experience. So it's you know, it gets very, very interesting. It gets very, very interesting when you stop and think about that. But this shows you the social construction
Yeah.
of you know, if you've got something that says 1/16, 1/8, there's some rule, you
Uh-huh.
know, blood quanta. Of course, now Native Americans use that for inclusion, and although we some African Americans have been citizens of those nations for some time, they've been disenrolling African Americans. So there's a big discussion now about Native American anti-black racism. or anti-black, whatever you want to call it. Now, it hasn't happened in all of them, and there's still some people of African heritage, mixed heritage, who are citizens and accepted as members of those nations. But in other circumstances, this is not the case. They would, there's been something going on. That's an issue that needs to be discussed. I'm becoming more transactional when it comes to these issues. If you want me to support your cause, you better act right. You better act right. And you better be consistent in your quest for justice. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I went on, but I hope I illustrated a problem. Now, you remember this woman, Rachel Dolezal?
Yes,
Okay,
the European.
she called herself African American and stuff. Of course, people hit the fan, and oh my goodness, this is terrible, terrible, terrible. But what's interesting about that, historically speaking, is that the idea that you would have a white person who wanted to call themselves black is like unbelievable to most people because of the internal, either the internalized racism that some African American, some blacks have, or the disbelief of whites that any white person would ever want to call themselves black. However, you can think about other examples of where people who were white, who were fully accepted, and who a lot of people don't know were actually white people who were accepted as black and actually got written up in magazines as being black. The person that comes to my mind is Johnny Otis, who was a rhythm and blues impresario. In the late 50s. You wouldn't know anything about him because you're not old enough. But Johnny Otis, we just thought Johnny Otis was another Adam Clayton Powell type African American. He was friends with Malcolm X. His wife was black. He hung out, but he was a Greek American. And in one interview, he said he made a decision if he was going to live his life as an American, it would be as a black American. So do we have the right as African Americans to decide who we accept as our own and allow them to call themselves whatever it is we call ourselves? It's an interesting question. So when you look at Kamala Harris and you have people saying, well, but she's not, but when they say she's not black, what they mean, they're not going by South Carolina definition. So black has now become an ethnic designator. She's not black for those who are saying that because she's not an Afro-North American of African captive descent, but nor was Barack Obama either. So neither one of them, and there is something of interest there, intellectually at least anyway, of raising that issue about, well, are these kinds of people, are these particular kinds of individuals, is there more acceptance of them
because they're not
white America because they're exotic? Okay, but then you have to be very careful. I mean, remember, some of our greatest heroes, we don't really think of them as being anything but African Americans, but in fact they did come from someplace else. Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte. We don't think, we've forgotten that they have come from someplace else. In fact, there's a lot of African Americans in show business, or there are a lot of Black Americans who are not descendants of people from of enslaved persons on U.S. soil, who have many high positions. That's been a point of some friction, at least in some corners, in some rooms where it's talked about. So if people say that Kamala Harris isn't, quote, black, what they're saying is that they're not saying that she doesn't have any African ancestry. They're saying something else. They're saying that she's not ethnically black. If we use black as an ethnic marker to restrict it to people who are descendants of folks from Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina plantations, if we restrict, then the answer is no, but nor was Barack Obama either. And so it becomes an interesting question. Now, of course, in Obama's case, he still is an African American because his father came from Kenya. So these terms, if we get into being concerned about linguistic precision, which is actually an interest of mine, I have a whole set of terminologies that I like to use that are accurate descriptions of people or accurate descriptions of certain situations and certain groups. Sometimes I think that it is useful to ask certain types of questions. Some of the very same people who are embracing Kamala Harris, though, and there are many of those, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for there's always this situation. Had issues with Zoe Saldana
Uh,
playing Nina Simone.
mm-hmm.
Now, Zoe Saldana is an Afro Latinx woman. There's more people with the two things about people of African descent in Latin America, including the Dominican Republic and Cuba and in Central America. Number one, there are more people down there in terms of sheer numbers who have obvious African ancestry, number one, than there are in the US and Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, when you throw in the people who have remote African ancestors who don't have obvious African ancestry, it doesn't, quote, show in their faces or their hair, then the number even explodes even more,
Mm-hmm.
becomes massive. So if we lived in a different time, imagine this is 1913, when the South Carolina, or 1820, when the South Carolina law comes into being about any known African ancestors. That means that if you came up here from Argentina and you could have blue eyes and blonde hair, but they imagine if they could do a DNA test and discover that you had 2% African ancestry, that Argentinian who had white privilege in Argentina would be put out on the plantation with my ancestors. It's interesting, isn't it? Okay. But anyway, I have digressed, but I digress in a way to try to make it what you're talking about understandable and palatable.
So now let's take it back, because you raised the point or the question of, the, how should we say, the professional categorization and labeling of things versus the internal, in terms of the population and how they label the same phenomena.
Okay. Now you
Right.
said professional. I did say professional, the etic view, but just think of that as the formal from whatever the authority is. So it could be the political system in certain situations. It could be, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I just want it to be, it's the external view as opposed to the internal view. That's all.
Okay.
External versus internal.
All right. So with that being said, let's go back 5,000 years.
Okay.
To the region of the world which started this conversation on this day, at least, and that is dealing with the ancient Egyptians.
Okay.
Now, depending on where you are in the world and your worldview, the ancient Egyptians were Caucasians who traveled to Africa and set up the civilization. But there's a lot of, us who believe that, looking at the monuments, looking at the artwork, that these were just normal Africans who lived in Northeast Africa, and that they are black.
Okay.
So for us, who have that opinion, we would consider them black people.
Okay.
But when you look at their literature, they do not recognize themselves as such. Now, I know there's going to be certain people in our community, who based off of Diop's hypothesis will try to argue otherwise. And those individuals, I challenge you to provide, the textual material to support that notion.
Okay.
But,
So,
but the question being, are we, given that internal versus external dynamic, us being the externals, would it be right for us to even label them as such when they themselves, in their height of power, did not label themselves as such?
well, the thing is that once you go back to a certain moment in time, in my view,
Uh-huh.
in my view, you don't have people who are theorizing. The ancient Egyptians, and for that matter, the ancient Greeks, did not have a theory of race. They did not have a theory of systematics. They did not have a theory of taxonomy. Okay, they didn't have that. They knew the people that they knew. They drew people on walls and they described them. I mean, they depicted themselves in different ways, and so in terms of describing the past, you can use various methods, statistical methods. You can use ancient DNA to talk about where you would place a population in relationship to other populations. All people and all populations are related, just to different degrees. And
Mhm.
any given individual may actually have all kinds of interconnections based because of the way inheritance works.
Mhm.
So, you know, I don't use certain terms to describe anybody in the ancient world simply because uh, I don't think that it adds anything to knowledge. But if you ask me, were the ancient Egyptians and African people? Absolutely. If you ask me, because there was a hiatus in the Nile Valley between 12,000 BP and 8,000 BP when there was nobody in the middle Nile Valley proper. They were probably all in the Sahara. They may have been joined by some other people or what have you, but the biological history occurred in the Nile Valley, which is Northeast Africa. Linguistically, now you know that I'm not as much of a linguist as you, so but I accept the thesis that says that Afroasiatic arose in Africa. So if to the degree that Proto-Afroasiatic was carried by non-food producers, those people did not come from the Near East. Okay, they came from the Sahara, from somewhere in the northeast quadrant of Africa. When you look at their ceramics, and when you look at the very beginning origin, and you look at their stone tools, they fit in right where they are. You know,
Mhm.
the fact that they may have incorporated uh, sheep and goat from the Near East, wheat and barley came from the Near East, doesn't mean anything. In fact, it's been shown that those things were incorporated into an indigenous foraging strategy, an indigenous strategy of subsistence. There was you don't have a turnover in the way that you would expect if people came uh, all at once, and there was like a big what in the past would have been called a Neolithic revolution. That there's no evidence for that in the Nile Valley. And when you look at some of the work by people like Patricia Smith, or even on the aspects of the body plan of people from the even northern Egypt, uh, at a certain moment in time, you see evidence of continuity with the previous populations and so forth. So it's very interesting that people will get hung up on certain things they're not even really discussing. Worth discussing in my point of view. The Saharo-Nilotic world gave birth to ancient Egypt. The Saharo-Nilotic world is in Africa. The actual physical appearance of the Egyptians would have ranged based on just standard evolutionary biological type criteria, north to south. I follow Gamal Mukhtar, who was an Egyptian himself on this, who talks about the black and light strain as being the core of the early Egyptians. And you have to be very careful about terminology, because having a particular skin color doesn't say anything else about any other characteristics that you may have.
Mhm.
Having a particular blood type, this is the whole problem with the notion of groups where you assume without proof that one particular characteristic is necessarily correlated, or I should say, traveling with another characteristic. In other words, the term for this is concordance. Sometimes this is true and sometimes it's not.
Mhm. So now it brings me to an issue that's fundamentally at the heart of this question as well, and that is, you know, everybody is debating whether the ancient Egyptians were black or not, based upon this notion of, the true Negro hypothesis. And if the ancient Egyptians don't look like a Yoruba, so to speak, then they're not black African. And so I know in previous conversations you've had with us before, you emphasize that there's no one way to be African. But, and so I wanted you to discuss, what are some evolutionary morphological traits that arose in Africa that may turn up in different populations on such this vast continent.
Well, in a way, I would say, not to be too dismissive, but some of this is actually quite silly. You know, you, are you familiar with Cheddar Man?
Yes, I'm familiar with Cheddar Man.
Okay, so here you have, they did ancient DNA on Cheddar Man from Britain. My gosh, good Englishman. Not really, because and I'll say something about that in a second. But anyway, they did the ancient DNA, and many people believe, based on that DNA, that he had dark skin, dark enough to be black, dark enough to be lynched in Mississippi. Let's use that criteria, the lynching criteria. But he had blue eyes, probably had straight hair, but his skin was dark. Okay. We also know that some skin genes for light skin arose in Africa. Why wouldn't you think that this would be possible? If modern humans emerged in Africa 200,000 years ago and only left 60 to 70,000 years ago, whenever they left, that's 140,000 years of evolution, 100,000 years of evolution, at least, for all kinds of things to have occurred, for things to have emerged and actually been lost. Okay. There's some also interesting philosophical, epistemological issues that a lot of people don't even really think about. For example, we'll say that the L2 mitochondria haplogroup, right, is African, right? You're familiar with this, right? L2,
Yes.
L3, yeah, you're familiar with that, right?
Yeah.
Oh, this is an African haplogroup. Well, 80,000 years ago, when there were no people outside of Africa, that at least no sustained modern human populations, no sustained communities of modern human populations, L2 was simply human.
Yeah.
So who gets to talk about and gets to define these categories? See, this is what people should be studying. The young people who are interested in these issues, these are issues that relate to philosophy and epistemology and the issue of who gets to decide. This is something that who gets to decide how these things are determined. And so we still have a lot of, it's not enough for people to run around saying Black Lives Matter. I don't care who you are. That's not good enough. And it's not good enough to simply say, oh, I'm going to practice Ibram Kendi's anti-racism. That's not good enough. You can say that all day long. No, you need, what's wrapped up in some aspects of Eurocentrism is not simply bias and obvious racism, but even the way certain questions get framed. I mean, the way certain things are looked at. The certain kinds of, even certain types of interest, I would argue, reflect the kind of Eurocentrism. And I will not take that too far, but the fact is that as people interested in science and knowledge, you don't give up the rules of evidence, but you have to also acknowledge that just like with some concepts in older science, like phlogiston and things like this, and other concepts, humors, that some stuff is just simply wrong and misleading and leads only to a certain amount of understanding, if any understanding at all. Sometimes you get things that seem to be like understanding, and it's not really understanding. It's an illusion at a certain level. And then some things work on certain levels like Newtonian physics, but they don't work at, the quantum level. I mean, there's a break in there. So, you know, uh, it's it's rather interesting that some people still think that there's an issue in terms of the peopling of the Nile Valley. And of course, when you have people who are positivists, this recent mummy genome study is extremely problematic. It's from a later period. We now have we actually have skeletal remains now. I mean, where they did strontium analysis, and they've actually caught migration from the Levant, from Southwest Asia, in real time. If you can actually catch it in real time, then it tells you it's been going on a lot, because statistically speaking, the idea that a few samples that you have from place X and you don't have a particular historical document to say, oh, these people moved at this time, tells you, and we know from other documents anyway, that it's been going on a long time. So all of the fancy statistics and the Bayesian analysis and all of that stuff applied to extremely small samples, 1 to 3 individuals for a complete genome, or one, and compared with others, no. But fundamentally and foundationally, the notion of not identifying a core Saharo-Nilotic group or a Northeast African group is the problem with that paper, along with some other things, over extrapolation for the question that they do answer. And actually, the fact that they, even their title is very revealing. The title is very revealing because it reveals to me the term race isn't used, but they might as well had said, oh, we're doing a race study. They might as well have said that. There are other, but that the data they have is real. There are other things they could have done with that data. They had 90 mitochondrial DNAs that the majority, although not all of them, may have an ultimate Levantine origin. And so by looking at the Egyptian texts and so forth, and contacts over, from the proto-dynastic period on, as well as actual records where they say, oh, people came from Southwest Asia and they worked as weavers, or they did this or did that, they could have told a totally different story about that site, that city. They could have told a story about evidence of migration into Abu Sir, consistent with the text, that it would support that. But no, that's not the story. They chose to tell a race story, which is very intriguing and very interesting. And they need to be called out on that. The leader of that group, they need to be called out. And I have some things that I'm writing, and that needs to be said, and I don't care how many declarations you've signed about being anti-racist and all that. No. You have to understand the depth of bias and be able to identify it in your own work.
Well, I have one last question, actually maybe two, but along those lines, another question is, when we talk about Berbers, who are the Berbers and where did they come from? Could they be considered, indigenous Africans, or could they be considered, migrants into North Africa who just been there a very long time and created their own, niche in that area? What is a more scientific and beneficial way to understand the biology and things of the Berber people themselves?
Well, okay. I think of populations, and others do as well, as not being usually distinct evolutionary units. They are ensembles. And when you look at the Berber genome, or when you look at, there's no such thing. When you look at the genetics of people who now speak Berber languages and who identify as Amazigh, you see a very interesting picture. In some communities, they have a very high frequency of Y chromosome lineage M81, part of the E haplogroup that didn't arise anyplace else but Africa. There's some strange papers that want to try to bring it from other places, but that doesn't work. The root of or the parent of that Y chromosome lineage, the M35, arose in East Africa. There's no two ways about that. So people can say what they want. The light skin that many Berbers, and some Berbers are very fair, look just like Europeans. I don't know to what degree that light skin is due to social selection, or what we would call sexual selection, acting on more recent migrants from or women who were either slave captives or people who migrated and joined the original core group. And you have to always remember, a group may be augmented by people joining the group. Also, Tunisian group found a unique L2 lineage amongst Berber speakers in Tunisia, which broke off from the other L2s a long time ago. So that may go back to the time of quote human. So that definitely is a local indigenous development. Now, I don't know to what degree Berber light skin, because they tend to be very light, although not all of them are fair. But I think they have a concept of themselves as looking a particular way, but not all of them are fair, as fair as we might think in terms of their skin color. The Berber biocultural history was assembled in Northwest Africa. It was not assembled in Norway and came down to Northwest Africa. It was not assembled in India or in North America. It was assembled right there. The biocultural history was assembled in Northwest Africa, and linguistically, as you know well, if you follow the Greenberg school, Berber is related to, is a member of Afroasiatic, and some people say Berber is more related to Egyptian and Semitic. Some people say Berber is actually more related to Chadic, which is quite interesting. So it just depends on what part of the language you're looking at, to make those determinations. It's like with anything else, this complex. If you look at one part of it, one part may look more similar to a similar part in another place, but other parts of it don't look similar to that. They look more similar to something else. And you would expect that in a complicated thing. So yeah, Berbers are African people. Berbers were there before Arabic speakers came. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know of any studies that show some sort of substrata in Berber and the Berber languages. They all seem to be very closely related, the Berber dialects and Berber languages and sub languages. I don't know of any substrata that seems to suggest that there was something there before. But then again, I don't read that literature all the time, but or I'm not up on that. But I don't know of that, and I do read enough of it. There have been some, at least that is accepted by standard historical linguists. Let me say it that way. So yeah, I regard Berbers as African people. Yeah, some of them have blue eyes and whatever, red hair. Many of them don't. Some of them have brown skin. Some of them are very, very white. At least in certain circumstances, they see themselves as having had their culture imposed upon by several different groups of invaders or people to the area, including the Phoenicians. So here's an interesting, again, another interesting, not paradox, but another kind of irony. Many people tend to celebrate Hannibal's fighting with Rome, right? But Berber nationalists, Amazigh nationalists, don't like Hannibal because Hannibal was what? In their view, he's a Phoenician. He's Carthaginian because Carthage was a Phoenician colony.
Yeah.
But isn't this interesting? Isn't this interesting? It starts off that way, if you believe the legends of Queen Dido and so forth. But by the time you get to the First Punic War, by the time you get to Hannibal, it is still proper to call Carthage
Phoenician. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that's an interesting question? At what point does the foreigner become native? At what point is the integration? I can tell you that the population was integrated. I know about a PhD, a DPhil done at Oxford, my alma mater, done by a student there who looked at skeletal remains from Ibiza in Spain from Punic graves, and he found evidence of a variety of people, including quote unquote some tropical Africans, and they even did ancient DNA on those tropical Africans. So in the crews of the Phoenicians, you have all kinds of people. The Phoenicians were very secretive and but apparently, there are all kinds of people. So when you look at some of the stone carvings and paintings and so forth from Roman Africa and from Carthage, you see a range of phenotypes. There was a big sarcophagus of a priestess of Tanit. And when they opened this sarcophagus, and I mentioned this in a publication I did in 1990, it wasn't me who found it. When they described it using the methods, they weren't doing multivariate methods back then. They were doing this old descriptions. They said, "Oh my goodness, this is a Negro woman in this thing. She's the priestess. My goodness." So I leave for those who wish to. I leave all of those who cannot accept such things or these discussions. I leave them where they are. I don't. There's no use in debating with people who are fundamentally racist. It's a waste of our time. What we need to do is develop new ways of thinking that do make sense, and concepts and perceptions that are non-racialist, because that doesn't make sense. It doesn't describe human reality, and that acknowledge the complex reality of human beings. This is what we have to do. And the African world is not simply the tropical African world, the so-called Black world. Sometimes when people talk about Pan-Africanism, what they're really talking about is a kind of Pan-Blackism, and they forget Algerians and Tunisians and so forth. But where did Nelson Mandela learn his guerrilla warfare skills? Who trained him? Where did he go? Where did he go?
I don't know. I know the Cubans came.
No. He went to Algeria. Colonel Boumediene. Colonel Boumediene, who was the second president of the Republic of Algeria, trained and taught Mandela. He said, "Look, you're not going to win on the battlefield." He said, "You do guerrilla warfare to get to the negotiation table." That's what he taught him.
Yeah.
And Ahmed Ben Bella died a few years ago, but he was on the Council of African Elders. And these are probably quote Arab Algerians, but this distinction between Arab and Berber, many of the people in the Maghreb are actually Arabized Berbers. They have Arab identity culturally, so forth, but if you want to use genetics, which you shouldn't, but their profile suggests that they were descendants of Berber people who became Arabized, as opposed to having the kind of profile you might find in Saudi Arabia, okay, or in the Levant, But even this gets tricky, because in the Fustat in Cairo, in the earliest quote unquote Arab, a Muslim settlement, according to one of the Egyptian anthropologists who studied the remains there, I don't know, 1/4 to 1/3 of the people buried at Fustat in this early settlement, had the kinds of physical traits that in the American context would be called Black. Now, these people were from, I don't know if these are East Africans who converted to Islam. You know the whole story of early Islam. The Prophet Muhammad sent the community to East Africa I'm sure that when they for safety from the pagans, but I'm sure that when they went back to Arabia, that many people followed them. So the earlier days of Islam, its so-called golden age, considered to be an age of relative egalitarianness. There was no color prejudice. There was no Arab elitism or chauvinism that eventually does emerge. Let's call it for what it is. But strictly speaking, uh, Islam would forbid racism uh, in the way that we understand it here. And so it's not surprising. In fact, there's a passage from a book, an old book, that speaks to one of the black warrior soldiers who the Roman prelate doesn't want to receive in Egypt when they're negotiating, when the Romans are leaving. And but this guy, the people, his co-soldiers, his unit says, no, this man is one of us, and we don't talk about black and white. There's an actual text like that. We see everybody as the same. And the man himself says, yes. He said, I'm here only to fight in the name of God. And that's what I'm doing. So it's very the world is more complicated than we think it is, at least in the ancient days. Then later on, things get distilled out. Someone should do a study on how institutions and the crystallization of cultures and civilization leads to a hardening or the development of certain types of attitudes, things that would have been not seen as even possible in an earlier period when things were more fluid. Remember, I mean, how does somebody like Alexander Pushkin, whose grandfather was a great grandfather, was born in Africa, went to the Tsar's court as a child, as a slave child. I forget the way he got there, but the emperor takes a liking to him. Peter the Great raises this boy up and makes him a nobleman, and marries him off to a noble Russia, to a noblewoman in Russia. So in one generation, he's gone from slave to nobility. It's quite interesting. And then two generations and a generation later, 2 generations later, you have Alexander Pushkin, who is the father of modern Russian literature, and who is not ashamed of his African ancestry. There's some situation where Pushkin is, they're making fun of Pushkin, or something that he's written or done or whatever, because I guess he's an experimental writer. And Pushkin gets wind of this, or he sees it. I don't know if it's written or whatever. And Pushkin says, oh, they can only be talking about me because I am the only Russian man of letters with a black ancestor, or an African. I don't know how he said it, black African. I don't know how he said it, but he says it. But he says it with strength. He said, I am a Russian man of letters with a black ancestor. It is his world. It is his world. I mean, it is a world that we would find very hard to understand, perhaps, given the experience in more recent times. It's far more variegated, and it's far more complicated and nuanced. And things allowed to some people are not allowed to others. Some people can talk about the glorious fight to throw off their oppressors, and other people, the moment you raise the specter of fighting for your freedom, somehow, or fighting to be included, somehow, oh, you're talking about violence. You can't do that. Well, I beg your pardon, and I'm not advocating violence. I'm making an observation about who has the right to claim the right to be able to fight for their freedom at all costs versus who doesn't, and so that's a totally different issue. But in terms of even scholastics, When we see papers written about Africans and the African diaspora that combine history and genetics and whatever, and we see no African scholars or African American scholars of note or Afro Latin scholars of note on these papers, there's a problem. There's a problem with that. You know, when Afro descendants who are trained as well as anybody else are trained in the way that others were trained are not allowed to participate in conferences related to questions that may be of interest, or don't get book contracts. This is nothing but some more racism. Let's call it for what it is. You know, call it for what it is.
Now, I know I said that was the last question, but this is kind of related to the last question, and you brought this up in a kind of way, you know, throughout your discourse, and that is, you know, to what extent, you know, like, and I know the answer is subjective, you know, ultimately, but you know, how long does a population have to exist outside of the borders of Africa to no longer be considered African, and vice versa? So like, let's assume, for example, that the biblical story of, you know, Jacob, you know, and Abraham and his family coming into Egypt, and then leaving out, you know, technically several million, but you know, the 400,000 leading men or whatnot, you know, they come in as like 80 or 90 individuals. It would be safe to assume that they have biologically, you know, integrated as well as culturally, you know, with the native population. And then, you know, say, but they were there allegedly 400 years. So could they still be considered, you know, non-Africans, you know, living in Africa 400 years? And if our answer is that they are Africans at this point, now let's look at the reverse when it comes to African Americans who have been out, you know, or you know, these populations close to 400 years. You know, would we still be considered, you know, saying Africans by that criteria if, you know, it's in the reverse? Like, you know, how long does a group have to exist outside or inside to be considered, you know, an African person?
Yeah, this is not a scientific question.
Yeah.
And I don't claim that every aspect of my being is wrapped up in the science that I was taught at the different colleges and universities I went to. I will say this: certain types of identities seem to have been able to take a life of their own, take on a life of their own. And so in terms of the current social political framework, they're viewed in certain ways. And that's as much politics as anything else. Or just what's been permitted or what's accepted. It's very interesting. You're talking about the Jewish people. If you look at look at Morant's book, The Genetics of the Jews, 5 to 10% of the Jews, even Ashkenazim, 5 to 10% of them actually carry a particular genetic variant that achieves what we call fixation in at least parts of tropical Africa. In other words, very high frequency, almost everyone has it. And of course, you know, the standard explanation for this is that, the people, when they were in Egypt or when they were here, they married black slaves.
Yeah.
What I call the black slave trope. Throw out the black slave trope. Let us consider that there may have been other kinds of human interactions that have nothing to do with the black slave trope. Black slave trope is a Eurocentric, racist convention. Yes, there were black slaves, but also some other types of slaves. There were Syrian slave women in Mali. There were in the medieval period. There were Saharan Jews in the oases. It wouldn't surprise me if at certain moments in time, due to all kinds of not so nice things, that some of those people found themselves being slaves in Sahel Belt kingdoms, as well as Northern Africa, based on some of what I've read about Saharan Jewry. So let's be logical here. Let's be logical. And there's that story in the Bible about Moses marrying the Ethiopian woman. It doesn't say that he simply slept with her. It says that he married her. I think there are different versions of that story, though. So some people want to say, well, she was a Midianite or this or that. You know, uh, and knee-jerk reactions to any one of these stories actually reveals the racialized and racist environments that we've grown up in. It's not about any pure discourse and pure interest and all, and we live in a time when we've had somebody lead us or be president of the country who has stoked certain kinds of things. Just leave it all aside. You know, look at things objectively as best you can. And there are gray zones in certain types of information, scholarship. There are gray zones, and some things are how you choose to look at things. One day you may look at them one way, and one day you look at the other. I mean, for those African Americans who view themselves as Africans as part of a diaspora, uh, I suspect that had people that there had people not been had captive Africans not been brought and reduced to the status of slavery here, but it's simply been brought as paid labor, that you would have a lot of people, including a lot of people predominantly European ancestry, who have some African ancestry, but you might not have a community that even sees itself as part of a diaspora. Okay, that's possible. In fact, in some parts of Latin America, in effect, that's what's happened. You do have distinct enclaves of Afro descendants, but most of the people who have an African ancestor are in the general population. And until they come to the US and get taught by people like Asar Imhotep that, hey, you got some African blood too, then they might say, wow, they might develop a notion of belonging to the African diaspora in a more macro sense, even if the particular culture that they practice may not be, African, or even African in terms of like their own country, the Afro descendants in their own country. So you go to Veracruz in Mexico, you see plenty of obvious Afro descendants. There's a monument to Yanga, who led a slave revolt. But there are also people with white skin in Mexico City who view themselves like they're Spaniards or something, but you do a DNA test on them and they got 10%, 5% African ancestry. So, from the point of view of politics, I think there's a way to use scientific information to actually show how interconnected we really are. And we are actually interconnected in ways, and some things, there may not be any foundational knowledge for certain types of things because the terrain shifts, because the terminology used to describe what you're looking at has shifted by it doing different eras and so forth. So, when you ask about Berbers didn't come from any place else. The Berber speakers, the Amazi, they come from Northwest Africa. Do they have some Eurasian ancestry? Or I don't like that term. Do they have some Southwest Asian ancestry and European ancestry? Yeah, sure. Yeah. But do they have an African root? Sure. Sure, they do. They have both. When you do ancient DNA on the remains from Tafarout, which are probably I don't know, 8 to 12,000 years old, you get that same picture. You get an African Y chromosome lineage, and you get a mitochondrial lineage that's generally deemed to be a Eurasian. Now, but that's also another issue that we can discuss another time. If something comes back to Africa 66,000 years ago, I'm sorry that if it's been there 66,000 years, then that's African, or 60,000 years ago. So if you tell me that the M haplogroup or the N haplogroup, and there's a new Y chromosome study that's has immense implications, because it shows that the YAP, that a particular mutation that leads to Africans and Asians originate in Africa. There used to be a debate about this, and for the longest, I believed that the ancestor split in two directions. So you had the ancestor in both places. But now some people say no, it's in one place, and they're saying that some of the other Y chromosome haplogroups, key mutations, also originate in Africa. They're using the timing of admixture with Neanderthals outside and dates that they have for remains outside of Africa to recalibrate the origin of these Y chromosome lineages. So it may actually turn out that there's a whole lot of stuff that people have been calling Eurasian that actually emerged in Africa. And that would not surprise me at all. At all. Conceptually, it makes perfect sense to me. Conceptually. So yeah, these people that we call Amazi have deep ancestry in Africa before there was any such thing as a Berber language, a Berber people. But at the threshold, at the time that something called Berber language interconnects with people who are in that region, or you get a fusion of populations so that you can then fast forward to what we have in front of us today, or to Hannibal's age, to the Punic period, or the period just before. Yeah, I mean, those events, that biological history, that fusing occurs on African soil. Therefore, it is a part of African biocultural history. And that's what makes it African. No one particular trait, no one particular skin color, no one particular body plan. The fact that the biocultural history occurs in that region in Africa, that's what makes it African, period. That's my view. And that holds up well from a humanities point of view, as well as from a scientific point of view. I studied with somebody at Oxford called G.A. Harrison and Tony Boyce. G.A. Harrison is responsible for having helped coin terms like phonetic and phyletic and even codistic, and so the Oxford department did a lot of taxonomy. They weren't doing so much of that in that way. They were doing some other innovative work just before I got there, some interesting work, but they got interested in health and stress, which is actually more relevant, which is really what we need to be talking about. How do we help take care of people? How do we get resources into communities so people can thrive? But also how kids who might be behind in school for whatever reason, like the lead poisoning in Flint, or just because they're behind for other reasons, we need to find a way to get tutorial programs because there are methods of teaching reading, for example, that will catch children up. If they're behind a year or behind the summer, there are methods that have been developed based on good neuroscience of how you can help train the brain to catch up in things like reading. Are these being used? I don't know. I mean, when in our cities that are controlled, or our schools in inner cities that have a high minority set of populations, are these techniques being employed? Are they being used? This is the information we need to get out to the people, along with our interest in deep time history, our interest in diasporic history. And I'm going to leave you on this, but there are a lot of Afro North Americans of Middle Passage descent who don't know that there are Afro Latins, that there are Black people in Latin America. I don't know if you've run into that, but there are people who get surprised when they meet somebody from Venezuela who is obviously of quote unquote tropical African descent. They say, "Oh, I didn't know there were any Black people." So it means the school system not doing a good job, or that our community, our external intellectual traditions, and the things we discuss are not doing a good job. Neither one is doing a good job. So let me say that. And these are things that are useful to consider in terms of what we do, as opposed to getting caught up in a lot of other kinds of things that are not worth talking about. We have to find a way to get resources, get good food to people, help people thrive, so people can have good bodies, but also have a good life of the mind. We pay taxes uh, get our kids involved in those things, and get people who have somehow developed a negative perspective and who fight with each other, war with each other over the crumbs of a society that denied them, politicize gang members so that they put down their guns and they get involved in the political process and community development process. But we have to demand the funds for that sort of thing. People do a lot of talking, but they don't do uh, the work that would be required to actually make the change. And I mean the people who can make the change. I mean, if I was a billionaire like Bloomberg, I would be doing some things on my own that would probably be upsetting people in certain cities, because I would be doing exactly what I'm talking about. But the people who are in charge, whether it's research into the medicinal properties of plants in Africa or the Caribbean, uh, whether it's trying to understand to move the needle on the deep poverty in some pockets in the deep South where I'm from, and but also in the cities, uh, to actually uplift whole communities, and these are the questions of the hour. These are
Mm.
the questions of the hour. And someone like Elon Musk, who's got access to great computing power, I would say that he could make a great contribution to his home country. He's from South Africa. I understand that he wants to colonize Mars. Okay, but and I like space, and I really admire the work that he's done. Those rockets, and I like the electric car too. I can't afford one, but I
Mhm.
like these things. But he's got access to drill down on the kinds of uh, macro and micro data that could be transformative uh, if he only did it for South Africa or some communities in South Africa. I believe that it could be useful. I think we have to have a different perspective on what ills society. But anyway, I've gone beyond what you were asking me about. But all of these things are connected.
Yeah.
All of these things are connected. And if you don't believe that, uh, just go to certain conferences and try to say certain things and see what happens. All of these things are connected. All of these things are connected. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to enlighten us on a very important and much talked about and politicized topic, and to bring some clarity, to these issues. And so, for those who are watching, as always, if you are new to this channel, please subscribe and click the bell button so that when I upload videos or we're doing a live, that you will be informed of the new material on the site, and leave a comment in the comment section, and continue the conversation. So with that, I would like to say, again, thank you, Dr. Keita,
Thank you.
for coming on, and until next time.
Okay. And I'll say that I'm going to be working on some things. I may give some small 10-minute talks on things like the skull. I know people sometimes have questions about uh, how certain things are done, but I'm thinking about doing some things like that so that people will actually be able to get an idea to benefit from it if they're interested. I have no idea, but I'll have to see. I'll have to see.
Indeed, indeed.
Okay.
So with that said, people, here, and we're working on some contact information for Dr. Keita, as he mentioned before. So we'll inform you of that. But here is my contact information if you want to hit me up on social media. And so until next time, peace.